Let's get started, please. Let's get started. My name is Rich Lyons. I'm the Dean of the Business School here, the Haas School at UC Berkeley. I want to welcome you to our event today, which is part of our Dean's Speaker Series. It is also part of an annual event that we call the David Aaker Distinguished Lecture Series in Marketing. Before I introduce our speaker today, introduce Dave, let me just take a minute to remind you of this Dean Speaker Series. So there are an awful lot of great speakers that come through this series. Next week, for example, we have a distinguished guest that is Susan Peters. Susan is the Chief Learning Officer at GE, runs all of the leadership development and all the training at Crotonville at GE, and is really a deep and very well-respected expert in leadership and in corporate education as well. That talk is the 23rd at 12:30, Wells Fargo, same place. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, friend, colleague, David Aaker. David is a professor emeritus here at UC Berkeley, was on our faculty for a long, long time, stays very much engaged with us. He retired in a formal sense in 2001, but as you can tell from his book and from many of the other things he'll talk about today, he is very, very far from retired. We set up this series in part to make sure that we got him back at least once a year to fill us in on his thinking, and every year he's got a lot of new content, as is the case this year with the new book that is noted up there. This is also a co-sponsored event, the Haas Marketing Club, the MBA Haas Marketing Club, and also our undergraduate Marketing Association. I see many of the students here. Thanks to you for coming. It's also this wonderful opportunity to hear from Dave. And in the area of marketing, many of you may not know this, at the MBA level, we turn out more people into marketing jobs than any other top 10 business school. Roughly 25-26% per year, very consistently. It is a very important area for us and has been for a long time. David's prolific career, over 100 articles, 15 books, many, many different languages this work has been translated into. He's recognized as one of the top, if not the top person in branding and has been for a long time. He's been called a guru. I think of Dave as Dave. Dave is one of these people that's just a wonderfully accessible and wonderfully high perspective person. He was the originator of the Aaker brand identity model, a model that many of you have worked with. It's a model that we've worked with here at Haas to think about what our brand essence is. This book today that he'll talk about, Brand Relevance, Making Competitors Irrelevant, that you can see on the screen here. We will learn an awful lot from him. There's no question about it. He's been on the faculty, I should have mentioned, since 1968. He was the E.T. Grether Professor of Marketing and Public Policy. He also serves as the Vice Chair of Profit Brand Strategies, San Francisco-based consulting firm that was set up by two of our Haas alums, Scott Galloway and Ian Chaplin, both of them MBA grads in 1992. David received his Bachelor of Science degree from MIT. His MS and PhD are from Stanford. And I want to thank David on behalf of all of us, and also me personally, because David is one of my favorite people. David, thank you very much.
Thanks, Rich. Well, it's nice to be here again, and thanks to Rich, I think we have the best dean in the country or in the world by a big margin. And I can say that authoritatively from a lot of angles. Since last year, it's a whole new world. I'm now on Twitter. You know, I'm no Rich Lyons when it comes to Twittering, but I Twitter, and I started a blog 3 months ago, so once or twice a week I write something on brands. And I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook, and it's really a fast-moving, bewildering world. And in that context, I've been studying brand relevance now since for about 6 or 7 years. I introduced it in my last book, Brand Portfolio Strategy, my last brand book. And since then, I've been working with it. I'm just really amazed at its power. You know, two observations from my research into brand relevance. First of all, you know, we all are engaged in very dynamic markets. New products, new applications, new emerging subcategories, new trends. It's very dynamic. And every time I look at that dynamic in any context, I think brand relevance explains it. It really explains what's happening, why some are emerging, some are declining. And it explains it because it drives it. What really is driving market dynamics is the emerging of new categories and subcategories, making some people less relevant and some people more relevant. Another observation is that it is really astounding how much of marketing expenditures have no impact. No impact, none. And most of those are probably wasted. And really, it's an extraordinary thing. And I look at category after category to support that assertion. I studied the beer market in Japan pretty extensively. And if you look at it over 40, actually over 50 years, there's been no change in market share trajectory in 50 years, except when 3 times when new subcategories were established, and a 4th time when a subcategory was repositioned. Extraordinary. I mean, from 1960 to 1986, Kirin had 60% market share, plus or minus 1%. Despite enormous monies and new products every year, 6 new products, a lot of money spent, nothing. And then Asahi came out with Super Dry in 1986, a beer that had more alcohol, no aftertaste. It was pitched to the young. It was a Western beer, and then it changed. Kirin lost 10 share points in a year and a half, and they were in free fall, and they tried everything, and nothing worked until they came out with a subcategory called Ichiban. And they stabilized the decline until in 1995, Asahi repositioned dry beer as the leading beer, the freshest beer, the global beer, and tragically, Kirin, they repositioned it as a draft beer because they hated it that Asahi was the #1 draft beer. So they walked away from all their equity and they went again into free fall. And that happened until they became the dominant brand in a new subcategory called Hapashu, which was a low malt, low tax beer. Extraordinary. You look at the computer industry. I mean, DEC didn't become a major player in the 70s, a multi-billion-dollar player, because it beat IBM. It created a new subcategory and dominated it. Sun didn't become a major player in 6 years, the fastest growing company in American history, because it beat DEC or it beat IBM. It created a new subcategory, network workstations. You can go after category, and it's the same story. The major changes occurred when somebody created a new category or subcategory. Well, let's step back and define brand relevance. If you look at a decision process, a customer first selects a category or subcategory. Maybe it's SUVs. And then it determines what brands to consider. Maybe it's Lexus, BMW, and Cadillac. And then selects which brand. The first 2 steps are brand relevance. And the really unique thing is that it brings selection of the category and subcategory into the process. The last stage is brand preference. And we spend way too much money and time on brand preference competition and way too little on brand relevance competition. And the routes to winning are completely different. In brand preference competition, you win because your brand is preferred over other brands. That's how you win. And the strategy is to engage in incremental competition. A little better, a little cheaper. And to engage in marketing programs, supported hopefully by a huge marketing budget, to tell the world that your brand is better than the other brand. The problem with this model is it's really hard to own an incremental innovation because somebody will copy you or at least live the impression they've copied you, and you have nothing. And all this marketing expenditures it just doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't lead to more sales. It leads to less profits. It's a brutal world. Now, in brand preference competition, it's completely different. You win because competitors' brands are not considered, not because you're preferred. And so the strategy is to engage in substantial and transformational innovation to create new categories and subcategories, and then to manage those categories and subcategories. Just like others are managing brands, you have to manage categories and subcategories. It's Econ 101. I used to learn a lot of my econ by listening to Rich talk to students. He used to be in the office next to mine, and he was always talking to students. I accused him of trying to get good teaching ratings by spending time with students. But it's Econ 101, right? You make money when there's no competition, or weak competition. And that's what brand relevance competition is all about. So it's very important to understand innovation. There's incremental innovation that helps you in brand preference competition. There's transformational competition, the Cirque du Soleils, that everybody kind of understands. You really change something very radically. But there's substantial competition. Substantial innovation is the tricky thing. So in substantial substantial innovation, what you're doing is improving it, something that people are that's already familiar with in their category. You're improving it so much that your improvement becomes a must-have. People will not buy from somebody that doesn't have a must-have. So, body armor, you can get body armor, but some will have Kelvar in it. And that's a substantial innovation. It didn't change what people make or what people buy, it just made it so much better that it became a must-have and defined its own subcategory. So it's really important to understand when you have a substantial innovation in hand and when you really have an incremental innovation. There's enormous payoff from this. I can give you, in the book has 100 different case studies. Enterprise Rent-A-Car went 35 years with no competition. They went 20 years before even anybody noticed them. They're now twice as big as Hertz, and they got much more profits. There's a whole bunch of examples like that. But there's also a dozen or more quantitative studies. One of them, for example, looked at 108 business launches. And those that were defined to involve new categories or subcategories was 14% of the sample, 38% of the revenue, and 61% of the profits. It's amazing. It's just amazing how little impact strategy directed toward preference competition results in. McKinsey study, 1,000 firms, 40 years, they looked at the new entrants into a marketplace, and they found that the profit premium, the ROI over the average in that marketplace, is 13% the first year. Even in the 10th year, there was still a small premium. And if you assume that new entrants are more likely to involve new categories or subcategories, that's pretty dramatic. And in marketing, we've had dozens and dozens of studies that show that new product success is correlated with differentiation. Me-too products just don't make it. And if you believe that differentiation is correlated with the existence of new categories or subcategories, that's further evidence. So how do you do it? And on one hand, it must be doable because there's so many people that have done it. But on the other, it's not so easy either. Anyway, I've studied this now. I've again looked at hundreds of case studies and so forth, and a lot of academic research. One of the small advantages I have over others that write for the business community is I can actually read academic articles. I think I'll stop there. But anyway, a couple observations. Let me just make 5 quick observations about all this research. One, ideas come from all over the place. And in the book I talk about 15 or 17 different ways you can generate ideas in an organization. You can ask customers, but usually that doesn't result in the kind of breakthrough you want. I mean, Henry Ford famously said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. But you can observe customers. And Procter & Gamble with ethnographic research has developed countless new subcategories in the last 15 years. But Marriott sent a team of 6 people for 6 weeks into hotel lobbies and looked at the way businessmen interact. And as a result of that, completely redesigned their lobbies with discussion centers, with the tables and so on, really changed the experience. You can be a customer. I mean, Quicken started when the founder observed his wife was having trouble with internet bill paying and record keeping. Zappos was started when the founder realized that it was pretty hard to find a selection of shoes in his size. You can partner with a customer. I mean, Procter & Gamble has now worked with Walmart as a team for 15 or 20 years, and they study logistics and accounting and warehousing and promotions, and they have a team that makes all those things work better. And they have really created a whole new subcategory in the packaged goods industry. And that involves a kind of relationship with your customer that Procter & Gamble has and a lot of their competitors didn't for a long time. Can be technology. Dryers figured out how to make creamy, low-fat ice cream with their new process that was a technology. It can be design. Design for some people become a must-have. They're not going to buy a brand that doesn't have the magic they're looking for. There's system solutions. Siebel in 1995 invented CRM, where they packaged a dozen different software programs, all involving the customer relationship and customer touch points. And they called it customer relationship management. And all those companies that were making those component software parts, it doesn't matter how good they are, they weren't relevant because that wasn't what people were buying anymore. And Siebel was in one of the growth stories of the last 15 years. You can augment the product. Best Buy bought a little company called the Geek Squad and made it go from 200 to 13,000 people and created a must-have for customers of consumer electronics. Sometimes it's CEO vision. Henry Ford had a vision. Ted Turner had a vision. Mike Harper got a heart attack, and then he got a vision. We needed some frozen dinners that are healthy, or at least not unhealthy. Second, timing is everything. You've got to have the market and the technology and the firm all ready. They all need to be ready, every one of them. You know, one of the incredible misconceptions about Jobs is that the reason he's so successful, incidentally, he's created 6 subcategories in 10 years, one of the more phenomenal achievements in all of business history. But people think it's his vision. Well, he does have vision, but more important than vision is timing. I mean, the iPad was introduced by Microsoft 10 years before iPad. And the iPod was introduced by Sony 2 years before Apple did. So Sony had the vision, but Sony didn't have the timing right. They came out with a product that was too expensive, could only hold 16 songs. And they had music, they had this complicated download system so that Sony Music was convinced that nobody would steal their songs. So they had the timing wrong. and timing has to be right. The Chrysler minivan, Lee Iacocca introduced it in 1982. They went 16 years with no viable competitors. 16 years. They sold 12.5 million vehicles. It saved Chrysler. And Lee Iacocca proposed that before he was fired at Ford 4 years earlier. But Ford had no front-wheel drive. Ford had a CEO that didn't want Lee Iacocca to have another success. And Ford had a huge station wagon business. They didn't want to, undercut that. They were making a ton of money on station wagons. The timing was not right. Ford was not ready. So it didn't happen at Ford. Third, the brand relevance competition is different in that it's no longer about my brand is better than your brand. So it's not about brand management, brand building, brand strategy as we know it. You have to manage the category and subcategory. It's a very different mindset. And sometimes it's difficult to make that transition. And the key to doing that is to become the category or subcategory exemplar. And we've studied exemplar in psychology a lot. And what it is, it's a brand that represents the category or subcategory. And because it represents it, it can define it. And that's so powerful because you want to define this category, not only initially, but you want to define it over time. And you want to define it in such a way that your must-have is really an important part of that definition. And as you innovate over time, you want to make sure that you manage the changing definition of it. But it also connects the brand to the subcategory. Because if you're not the exemplar, you have the job of becoming relevant by connecting yourself to that category or subcategory. And that can be really tough and expensive. And it can be risky because you risk somebody else having a stronger connection. But if you're the exemplar, if you're Prius with hybrids, if you're iPod, then you have a huge edge because you automatically connect it. I mean, you're defining it, you're it. And you're sort of the Kleenex of the category. I want to buy a Kleenex or I want to Xerox something. You're part of the category. So all these brands have become exemplars. So CNN, ESPN, they define what the category is all about. And Tide Cold Water and so on. So how do you become an exemplar? Well, there's three things. First, you have to, with discipline, market the category or subcategory and not the brand. And Salesforce.com became the exemplar of cloud computing by doing that. They never talked about buy Salesforce instead of some other brand. They talked about why you need cloud computing. Because it's so much easier to install, to repair, to service, to upgrade, and because it's actually safe and it's reliable and it's going to be always there for you. So they only talked about the category and subcategory, never the brand. Second, you need to be the early market leader. It doesn't work if you're one of the small also-ran companies or brands. So if you look at Prius, they weren't the first hybrid in America. Honda was. But Prius took over and dominated the market. iPod wasn't the first music player of that type. MP3 player. It was Sony and there were others. But iPod took over and dominated the brand. So you don't have to be the pioneer, but you have to be the early market leader. And finally, you need to be the authentic brand. Authenticity is really important. Now, when Asahi Dry Beer came out with their new category in 1986, one of the things Karen did was come out with Karen Dry. I mean, it was the identical beer. It was just as good, but it wasn't authentic. And people knew that because, first of all, they knew the story, how this incredible upstart firm was able to do such a dramatic thing in the marketplace. They knew who did that. It was Asahi. And they knew that Kirin was just trying to rip them off. Besides, Kirin didn't have all the other associations that made it authentic that Asahi had. It didn't work for Kirin. So you've got to think about authenticity. That means things like trust and reliability and being pure to the promise. Fourth, you need to create barriers to competition. Again, Econ 101. If you get a monopoly, you need barriers. Otherwise, you lose it, right? I always like to give economists a little bit of accolade when I can. When they have something that is relevant to the rest of us, then I like to point that out. We need barriers to protect our monopolies. So how do you do that? Well, there's three kinds of barriers. One, you can just execute over the top. And Zappos created this new subcategory, which was a shoe store on the internet, and they have over-the-top service. They don't spend money on marketing. They devote it all to their 24/7 call center. And the service is supported by a set of 10 values, the most famous of which is have fun and be a little weird. And so the whole nature of the relationship, the whole personality of the brand is affected by those values. Really hard to copy. Really hard to copy. Second, you can continuously innovate. So if you look at iPod, then we had the Nano, we had the Shuffle, we had the iTouch, and ultimately iPad and iPhone. It's really hard to compete against a moving target. It just doesn't stand still. So innovation is a key thing. And the third is to get beyond functional benefits. To surround your brand in this new subcategory with things like a personality, like organizational associations, things that are going to be hard to copy but become must-haves. So like Panasonic, I monitor brands in Japan. We've done this for 10 years. We measure 1,000 brands, and Panasonic is always in the top 10, usually in the top 5. And the reason is that they have this incredible program they get credit for being the most sustainable company. They have a whole line of products. They have an ecosystem that manages the energy in your home and in other building. They themselves are very sustainable in terms of their plants and product packagings and so on. And finally, they even encourage the sustainability message in the larger population. Quite incredible. And in doing so, they in effect created a subcategory that includes companies that have a social concern. And that segment in the United States, I should add, is growing rapidly. Finally, look at underserved segments. So one of the great brand stories of the last 10 years is Nintendo. In our study, Nintendo went from 165 to 65 to 7 to 1 to 1, and now it's 3. Most amazing change in brand position that we've seen in 10 years of running that survey. And the way they did it is to say to themselves, we're going to let Microsoft and Sony, go after the heavy user, the young male that likes violence, that likes graphics, that likes high speed. And we're going to go after moms and girls and families and give them involvement and give them educational stuff and so on. We're going to do something completely different. And so they looked at the underserved segment. Luna broke into the energy bar system by creating an energy bar for women called the Luna. So anyway, that's just some ideas. The book, of course, has much more about how do you go about creating categories and subcategories. And a lot of these things are not obvious. The fact that there's you just don't turn out concept exploration to the market research important. You've got to be on top of things so you get the timing right. You've got to worry about managing the category or subcategory. You've got to create barriers and look at underserved segments. Great quote. You do not merely want to be considered the best of the best. You want to be considered the only one who does what you do. So a challenge. What percent of a marketing budget in your firm goes to establishing and defending offerings that dominate a category or subcategory? That's brand relevance competition. And what percent support brands that are fighting established competitors in established categories or subcategories? That's brand preference competition. You want to change that percentage. Just one last thought. Brand relevance is also a threat as well as an opportunity. It's a threat because if you no longer mate what customers are buying, you're going to fade. Let me elaborate on that. So if you look at McDonald's, they were being challenged, becoming not relevant for a lot of people because they were going to Starbucks for their mid-morning coffee, even for breakfast. So McDonald's came out with McCoffee, not to be better than Starbucks. Their goal was not to win the brand preference competition. Their goal was to be relevant, to be good enough so people would no longer avoid McDonald's. You know, Walmart, incredible story. 8% of America 6 years ago were boycotting Walmart because, of a litany of bad things they were perceived to be doing. And in 1995, in a camping trip, the CEO of Walmart decided that, he would do something about the environment. So he embarked on a sustainability program that was remarkable in its scope and impact. And to his surprise, he found that not only was this doing good for the world, but it was saving a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. His trucks, his packaging, his warehousing, everything was a lot cheaper. And it was helping him attract sales because there was a lot of customers that wanted to buy stuff like this. So it turned out to be a win-win-win for Walmart. And I just saw an article a few months ago that said it's hard to hate Walmarts anymore. It's remarkable. But also you can use relevance because you lose energy and visibility, and therefore you're not considered. That's the other part of the relevance model, remember? So what we know, there's a great book called The Brand Bubble that explains the data behind this, but we know that brands just need energy. And brands are losing equity all over the world because they're losing energy. So one way to get energy is to energize the business. And Dove was a $200 million bar soap back 20 years ago, and now it's a $4 billion company, and they've introduced the Dove moisturizer concept into 6 or 8 different categories, and they've developed these incredible, what I call branded differentiators like the weightless moisturizer. A lot of energy into Dove because of the business. But you can also find something with energy and attach it to your business, or find or create, that is. Like the Avon Breast Cancer Crusade and the Avon Run for Breast Cancer. Enormous energy for Avon, which is really kind of a bit of a boring category in many respects for most. But here they have a program that has substance behind it. They raised $640 million for breast cancer. It's got enormous involvement and participation. And it's not a short-term, one-shot promotion. I mean, this is 20 years almost they've been at this. So back to where we started. There's all these market dynamics. It's hard to understand, hard to respond to them, And it's really important to be in a position where you can drive them. And I think the key to all this is brand relevance. So that's it. Thanks for having me again, and we'll have some questions.
Thank you, Bill. And we continue to capture as much of our content as we can to make it available to you later and to those who couldn't be here. So I'm going to ask you to use those microphones. But please, anybody who's got a question, we would love to take one. Please, sir.
So recently, Groupon has gotten a lot of attention for being one of the fastest growing companies ever.
Which one?
Groupon.
Oh.
And there's been a lot of articles looking at clones that are out there that are emulating the same business models and are kind of trying to take over the market share by having a more local feel, since Groupon's kind of the more mainstream international company. I mean, how do you feel a company that's moving that fast in such an energetic space can kind of have some subcategory relevance?
Well, I think Groupon is a good example of a company that's become the early market leader and is dominating that category that they are now participating in. But when you have something that it's that dynamic, then everything is telescoped down. So, maybe you'll have a monopoly for, 8 months or a year and a half instead of 18 years. But the principle is the same. What you try to do is to create those barriers. You try to innovate, to make it a moving target. And so that's what eBay did, and eBay was able to maintain their position for a long time by continually innovating and changing. And I might add, again, in the eBay context, the use of a brand portfolio and sub-brands help you in that, because what you want to do is to create new must-have, new must-haves, new must-haves, and that all require communication and so forth. So that's one thing Groupon needs to do, I think, is to innovate. And the other thing is that if Groupon can, create a huge following base, I mean, that's the ultimate barrier, because then you could have a much better product than Groupon, but you're not going to be able to break in because it requires a huge follower base in order to work. And Groupon has that. Not only a follower base of people that buy into it, but people that are selling. But it's going to be interesting. It's always interesting to watch something that can happen so fast. We're not talking about Enterprise Rent-A-Car or the Chrysler minivan, where we had decades with virtually no competition. And an interesting role model for Groupon would be Apple and the iPad. And you look at what's happening in that market and how Apple is holding off some really vigorous, big competitors with good technology. But it's tough for them to break in.
If I may ask one, and please just step to the microphone. As you see firms go after this more, further upstream at the brand relevance stage, what sorts of things are they doing organizationally to make themselves better at taking advantage of these ideas?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, it's an organizational challenge. And what I say is that organizations have to have 3 characteristics in order to do that. And these 3 characteristics are in conflict. First of all, they have to be entrepreneurial. They have to be quick on their feet. They have to be external, have an external information system. They have to be flexible. They have to be in multiple product markets. But at the same time, they have to be able to commit. They have to be able to do incremental innovation, because if you get onto one of these things, you've got to commit to it. You've got to solve the problems. You can't give up too early. And that's one of the things that we see a lot. People give up too early, and they are risk averse. And there's a third thing. You have to, well, incidentally, Charles O'Reilly used to be a professor here, wrote about the fact that companies need to do these 2 things simultaneously. And So I'm not the first one with that idea, but it's a huge challenge. But there's a third thing. They have to be able to allocate resources across the organization. Because what happens is the large organizational units suck the resources out of the air, and they suck innovation out. And you look at Microsoft, of course, it's famous for the fact that Windows and Office, so huge, so profitable that anything else is not worthwhile. So it's really hard for Microsoft to be the innovator in that space. And that's true with, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and everything. So the challenge is to be able to allocate resources so that these promising innovations that have the potential to establish a category or subcategory are really funded. Not only when you're getting the technical tweaks out, but when you're introducing it into the marketplace, you're building barriers, and you're protecting it.
Other questions, please. Yeah, could you use the microphone, please?
Well, you can just tell me, I'll repeat the question.
Okay, very good.
How would you apply this concept to competition with nonprofits and research centers?
How would you apply this concept to nonprofits and research centers? Well, I think it applies every bit. It's the same. It's a mindset. Are you selling a category, or are you going to build a brand? And it's very different. If you think in terms of a category or subcategory, your perspective changes and the way you spend marketing activities change. And at the end, you'll result in a stronger brand. You look at, is it Teva, the one that has the microfinance, that pioneered that? That was done actually with a Stanford student, not a Haas student, but there's probably Haas examples as well. But anyway, they built the subcategory, and they taught people what microfinance in their world was. And now you have some other microfinance companies emerging, and I think if they create new subcategories, instead of trying to say we're better than Teva, that they're better off. And I was talking to Rich about business schools and their branding, which we've talked about many times. But I think if you look at it as, if you created some things that are so different, that have so many must-haves, that it becomes a subcategory. So we're not trying to say that our brand is better than Stanford. We're trying to say we've created a place where we have competence without arrogance. Have I got that phrase right?
Confidence, yeah, without attitude, without arrogance.
Without attitude,
yeah.
without attitude. Yeah, arrogance is a little strong, isn't it? But that can become a must-have, and that can become a whole new subcategory. So let's talk about, this is a type of business school you might want. Not that you want Berkeley versus somebody else. You want to build that whole category. Good question. Yeah.
So you gave some examples about products that were developed to build new categories. Do you think for services is it more challenging to create to come up with new ideas to create new categories than it's for products?
So what was the
for services in general?
The first part of your question?
So you mentioned some very interesting examples about new products that are related to new categories, but how does it is it harder to do the same for services?
Yeah. Well, whether you're talking about brands or categories or subcategories, the difference between services and products are that services are delivered through an organization. And an organization is an integral part of the experience and of the offering. So that has a lot of implications. That means that when you talk about an organization, you're talking about programs like the Avon Breast Cancer Crusade. You're talking about a type of people like they have at Zappos. You're talking about a culture, like they have at Virgin Airlines. So and it's very hard to duplicate programs, people, and culture, where it's easier to duplicate this type of toothpaste or this type of car. So, so then what you usually have to focus on are those kinds of things, because those are the kinds of things that are going to differentiate your brand or define a new category or subcategory. So the ones that do that in the service sector usually have really strong culture based on a set of values. It really has a discipline in hiring people. And of course, Zappos famously gives people $4,000 to quit. And if they're the least bit unhappy, they want them gone. And they'll have a set of programs that that are driven by those values and that culture.
Other questions?
Hi, you mentioned Microsoft. I was wondering if you had any advice for somebody that would bring a product to market like Windows Mobile, where they would appear to be the follow candidate.
Boy, I don't know anything about Windows Mobile. Is anybody, except that Windows Mobile, are they the ones that are forming an alliance with Nokia? Yeah. I was just talking to a brand, one of the leading brand strategists of Sweden about Nokia. And they're in a tough place because there's this whole new subcategory that have created under really cheap phones, defined by low price, simple. And then there's the smartphones, and they just were left behind. They're out, and so they don't have a lot of options. So what they're trying to do is trying to become relevant by fast by getting it with Microsoft. And Microsoft has got its own similar problems, and so they want to try to get relevant fast by merging with Nokia. And it's probably a strategy with a low to moderate probability of success, but it's probably the best strategy for both of them.
Thanks, Dave. This will be the last question, please.
Can you comment on Sony Corporation? Because back in the day, Steve Jobs was a big fan of Akio Morita. Was it the death of the founder of Sony, or what happened after Walkman?
Well, yeah, Sony, if you look at Sony in the 80s, it was the Apple of its day. It had all these innovations, Walkman, and I think Morita is the reason. I mean, he was the Steve Jobs of his time. And to have a spectacular CEO like that is extraordinary. I don't think the CEOs of Sony that followed him were bad. And we've had some bad CEOs that I like Smith of GM and so on, but they weren't bad. They were good, but this Morita was a genius. He was a Jobs. And so I do think that had a thing. But there's a lot of, I talk about in my Spanning Silos book, all the problems that companies face in terms of silos, and Sony is really got silo problems. They haven't been able to overcome it, so that's held them back. And they've also were so analog. So all these brilliant products of the 80s were analog. And when you go digital, then you lose all that analog equity and all the analog advantage. And so they wanted to go digital, but they were tied to the analog stuff, and it was really hard for them. And all these other people had no equity in analog, so they were off and running. But Sony, it's still one of the top 5 brands in Japan. It's still got a lot going. It's still got really great technology, but they have a hard time turning that technology into marketplace winners, and they have a hard time overcoming this silo stuff so they can get synergy from that company. But I wouldn't give up on Sony.
Dave Aaker, you are your own category, sir. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Rich.